Matthew 22, we're going to read verses 1 to 14. We're continuing our theme of looking at parables about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, the same thing. And today we've come to the parable of the wedding banquet. And only Matthew records this parable. Luke has one that's similar, a parable of a great banquet, but there are significant differences to that one as well, and probably were given on different occasions. But here Matthew gives the parable of the great banquet. So Matthew 22, starting at verse 1 through to verse 14. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. And he sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who've been invited that I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and fatted cattle have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. And the rest seized his servants, ill-treated them, and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. 'Friend,' he asked, 'how did you get in here without wedding clothes?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'" Well, as we come to look at this parable, I'm guessing that for many here, it's a fairly familiar parable. It's one that you've probably heard many times before. And as I say, it's very similar to Luke's parable of the great banquet. But there are significant differences. And I say, it probably is the case that there are two different occasions when Jesus taught about the kingdom of God and used similar parables to teach similar points. But here we have Jesus now. Let's just put it into its context first of all. This is the week between riding triumphantly into Jerusalem and his arrest at the end of the week and subsequent crucifixion. So we're in the middle of the week. I'm calculating it's probably Tuesday of that week. And so Jesus is around the temple courts. He's staying outside in Bethany, just a short distance outside of Jerusalem, and coming in each day. And here he is, say, probably on the Tuesday. He goes in, and he has a busy day on that Tuesday, because if you actually look at what took place, he has many encounters, and but during that day, he also teaches a trilogy of parables. There are 3 of these parables. And here they are. You'll find in chapter 21 that you have the parable of the tenants. And these are the ones who came and they rented a vineyard. And when it came time to pay the rent, they didn't ask for 3 months up front. At the end of the season, the owner would come and take their grapes for their wine, and that was how they pay them back. So you've got the parable of the tenants. Before that, sorry, I should have said the parable of the two sons. The sons who were asked to go and work in the vineyard. One said yes and didn't go, and the other said no and did go. So you've got that one first. Then you've got the parable of the tenants. And then the third one is the parable of the wedding banquet. And each of these parables actually teaches, along similar lines, about judgment. And that's not surprising, because Jesus is coming towards the end of his ministry here on this earth. And he's taught a lot, and he's told parables about God's love and God's grace and his mercy. And he's expressed that and shown that as he's gone about his ministry in healings and showing compassion to people. But now as they come to the end, and particularly as the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the religious leaders, they're all watching Jesus very closely. And in fact, they even come to him and they start to question his credentials. Who gave you authority to be here and to be teaching in the temple courts? Where's your ordination certificate, they're saying? Where's your license to preach? And Jesus, of course, was far too clever for them. And no matter what they tried to do, he always had an answer for these religious people. But it upset them so much that they went to try and find a way to kill him, because they knew that in each of these parables that he was speaking out words of judgment against them. In the parable of the two sons, the one who said yes and didn't go, of course, was them, the religious leaders. They're the ones who apparently have said yes to God, and then when it comes to it, they're the ones who are turning their backs on him. In the parable of the tenants, they're the ones who are in receipt of the vineyard. They're the ones who've been able to have the luxury and the pleasure of growing their vines there. And then when the owner of the vineyard, God himself, says, now I'm coming to collect what's due to me, they turned against him and against his servants, the prophets, and rejected him. And now in the parable of the wedding banquet, Jesus, for a third time, speaks out and shows these religious leaders what hypocrites they are. And so this is the background to the parable. A wedding banquet, of course, was quite a common thing. Lots of people got married, and when marriage happened in a community, it was a big event, just as it is today. Marriages can be, incredibly lavish. Exactly 1 year ago today, the 19th of May, many people were glued to their television screens, watching a particular wedding in Windsor take place, with all the pomp that went with it, the lavishness of it, the horse-drawn coaches and everything else as Harry and Meghan tied the knot. And I suppose that's the closest thing that we've had in recent times, at least, to what is happening here in this parable. That he's saying this is not just anyone, not just somebody whose son or daughter is getting married and they're inviting the community to come, although indeed, if that happened, communities came usually en masse, and it would be a big event. But this is a parable about a king who does it. More about the king in a moment. But let's just talk about preparations for wedding in general. Weddings lasted for, 7 days. That's right. That was quite normal. 7 days for a wedding ceremony. And what would happen is the guests would arrive on day one, and gradually as they kind of went through the week, there was just constant celebrations every day, more celebrations going on, until finally at the very end, on the last day, the father would take the hand of the bride, put it in the hand of the groom. The actual ceremony itself of uniting the couple together would be made, and they would be sent off to go and form their new home, with everybody there watching and witnessing. But preparations for a wedding take time. Anyone who has been through a wedding will know this. We've just celebrated 16 years this week just gone, and just looking back now, although it kind of in some respects seems like yesterday, and in others it seems like an eternity, yet nevertheless I still remember kind of all the preparations going on, and I think to myself, that weddings, they just take so much planning and preparation to get things done. And some people spend an awful lot more time, effort, money than we ever did on the event. Now, if you think about how much time is spent today doing that, imagine going back to the Middle East 2,000 years ago when there were no supermarkets to go and just buy what you wanted. You couldn't go and hire a wedding planner to come in and do it all. The florist wasn't just down the road and you just kind of went in there, put your order in for the flowers you wanted, and hey presto, bouquets come out at the appointed time. This was all DIY, and it took an awful lot of time and effort to put it together. It would have taken weeks, actually, absolutely weeks and weeks of non-stop hard work to put a wedding together. And for the poorest people, it would have been possibly years of saving as well for that event. But this is a king, so we're assuming that money is no object. And we're also assuming that help is no object. So he's got lots of people around him, servants, to do much of the work. And yet still, this is going to be lavish. And so, everything has to be just right. And despite the fact that it was 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, don't think that therefore it would have been unsophisticated. I mean, they actually went to great lengths, and it might have surprised us if we were able to transport ourselves in time back to one of these grand weddings to see just how elaborate they were, and how much effort went into these weddings. So it would have been an incredibly luxurious occasion, no expense spared, and say every effort would have been made to make the place look absolutely fantastic. But because it takes time, this is how the system works. They didn't have watches, and we are tied to time. I broke my watch this week, and just the strap, nothing serious. But managed to break the pin holding it together. And, for the last 2 days, I've been completely lost without my watch. And I keep sort of looking and thinking, it's 2 freckles past 1 hair, and, kind of things like that. And lost because we're so governed by time. But, of course, back then, and indeed in some communities today, time isn't quite so important as it is to us in the West. So how did they do it? They sent messengers, servants, who went out to the invitees, and they would proclaim the invitation. They didn't have nicely printed up invitations to take round and offer to everyone. They would literally go out there and proclaim the invitation. So they would come and bang on your door, and there would be the scroll that they would take the scroll, unravel it, and there would read out the invitation to you that the king invites you to the wedding of his son. But it doesn't tell you when. And the reason it doesn't tell you when is because they weren't actually sure when it was going to be. But the idea is that you now had to be ready and prepared for when the next message came, which is, come to the banquet, we're ready to start. And so you were given a bit of warning as well. And there were things that you had to do also in preparation for the wedding. So you'd have to get yourself ready and make sure that you had your wedding clothes. Now, I know there's a mention of wedding clothes later on. And some experts and scholars think that the king would have provided the wedding clothes. And that is possible, particularly, as it was such a lavish event. But in all probability, normally at a wedding, you wouldn't expect, despite what some experts say, you wouldn't expect the guests, the host to provide all the wedding clothes. So instead, the guests would be expected to come in their finest array, to find the best clothes they had, and if not, to make the best clothes that they could possibly come up with. Because you had to wear, you couldn't just wear ordinary garments to a wedding. This had to be something that just looked so super special. A little bit like today. I mean, if you saw people turning up, who turn up to a wedding today out in the streets in those clothes on a normal day on the Monday, you might kind of think, wow, I mean, that's a bit out of place here. But that's the whole point, is that these were meant to look lavish as well. And so they had to get themselves ready. The king has sent the invitation. He's now got on with getting the preparations done. The decorating is done. There's a lot of people coming to this. He's a king. He's going to invite lots of people. It's going to be a big area. The palace is going to be all dressed up and decorated. Then he's going to make sure he's got the very best of food and drink that's available, so that his guests are not disappointed when they arrive. And I say this is going to go on for 7 days. I mean, this isn't just one big banquet. This is like 7 days of partying that's going to go on. So there needs to be an awful lot. He's getting ready again and again, just making sure every fine detail is done. And then comes the great day. The day when the wedding is prepared and ready. And so the king sends his servants again. And he sends them out to the invited guests. Verse 8. He said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready. It's before them. Verse 4. And 3 even. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come. Let's stop there for a minute, because what he's actually doing here is this. He's omitted the bit of sending out the initial servants, okay? That's given. The fact that they've been invited. And now he jumps straight to the point of where he goes out and says the wedding is ready. And he uses this word here and tells them to come. And this is not just an invitation. We've got to understand here, this is much more than that. This particular word is very strong. It's the imperative form of this word, and it means it's a command. It's not just, you're invited, would you like to come, yes or no. It's the wedding is ready, it's prepared, come now. But they refused. We don't know why they refused. We're not given that. It's a story, so it doesn't really matter. The point is, they refused. Now, I can't imagine anyone turning down the invitation to the royal wedding. But these people, for whatever reason, they were chosen. They were singled out in the community. And they were invited. They were privileged guests who were invited to come. They said yes, which means they've made a commitment. And now that they've come to that crunch point where the king says, come now, it's ready, they refuse. They turn away. But the king is not going to take no for an answer. So it says in verse 4, then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who I've invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted cattle have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. He says all the food is there. The oxen, which would have been, and the fatted cattle, the only difference there really is the fatted cattle they're the young ones. They're sort of like veal, if you like. whereas the oxen refers to older animals. He's saying that I've prepared everything from the young to the old. Every taste is prepared for every eventuality. And he said, I've taken the finest of what I've got and I've prepared it ready for them. It's for them. I mean, I've done this for them and they've refused to come. Now you go back to them and you tell them, come. Come to the wedding banquet. Don't invite them. They've been invited. They've said yes. Now tell them, you be there. And this is the king speaking. So, you don't disobey Middle Eastern kings. Or else. As indeed these found out. But it says in verse 5, they paid no attention. And look what they did. One goes to his field. Another to his business, literally his emporium. His place of selling stuff. They were more interested in going about their everyday business, about opening the corner shop, than they were about going to the royal wedding. I mean, how they've got their priorities wrong. But it's worse than that. Because it says that the rest seized his servants, they ill-treated them, and they killed them. Well, not surprisingly, we're told the king was more than just a little bit angry. He was furious at how he'd been snubbed and treated by these people who'd been invited, who'd said yes, these chosen ones. Now you've got to understand that standing around listening to this are all the religious leaders in the temple courts, watching Jesus, watching his every move, suspicious of him. And straight away they know that this parable is directed at them. See, they know straight away that Jesus is talking about, for a start, he's already said it's about the kingdom of heaven. So he said, this is what I'm trying to explain. This is the kingdom of heaven. And the nearest thing I can think of to help explain it, says Jesus, is it's like this king who gives this wedding feast for his son. And of course, the thing that the Jews were waiting for was that great banquet to take place. They were waiting for the day when God would send the Messiah, his son. And that there would be this great celebration as he comes to his people and in effect marries them, if you like. He's joined together with them. And the point about when a marriage takes place, and we could go into all kinds of teaching here on marriage, but I don't want to do that today because that's a whole another thing. But let me just emphasize one point here that we've lost in today's society. Marriage today is very often seen as a temporary measure. We get married until we get dissatisfied with it. And then it's easy enough then just to break that off and divorce. Just recently we've had in the news talk about, ending of no-fault divorce and all things like that. And gradually over the years, divorce has been changed and been made so much easier over the years. Going back from the times some while ago when you needed an act of parliament to actually dissolve a marriage. How about that? To today where you can have no-fault divorce. But why is it then that biblical marriage is described as the union of one man with one woman forever, or at least for life? Why is it like that? Because marriage is actually a picture of what God is doing with his people. He says marriage is it's great, and we're actually playing out what God is doing in our lives. So in our lives, we're playing out what God is doing. Let's rephrase that. And what we find here is that in the marriage, and when it's a union of two people together and they stick together for life, is that we are acting out exactly what God promises to do with his people. That he will come. So Revelation says that when God came to his people, he says, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will be with them. He will be their God and they will be his people. And he says this is the covenant come together, and it will never break. He will never leave them. He is now united with them. And you know, the interesting and significant thing is that at this time in the book of Revelation, as it describes all of this, that we then also have this amazing thing here, because there is then a marriage feast takes place. And he says, now that I've come, now that he says we have seen the bride and the groom come together, the bride, the church, and God's people, and that he's now come to meet the bride. He says, and now he says we've got the whole lot together. There needs to be a celebration of this. And so we act this out, and this is played out. Now, some people say, hang on a minute, that's unfair. You can't sort of say to people that you just have to stay together for life. And I know that this is not a perfect world, and so we will find that there are separations in marriages. And it's always a tragedy when that happens. But that's because sin has entered into our world and has messed it all up. But it might also surprise you to know that God divorced his people. This is the God who says, I want to be with them forever, and that God divorced his people. You look in the Old Testament, you'll see there in Hosea that God divorced his people. Why? Because they were unfaithful. What does Jesus say about that in the New Testament? He says that marriage is for life except for one thing, unfaithfulness in marriage. He says there's the reason. And so I don't want to get too bogged down into that, but there's just one illustration that comes out of this that we need to be taking on board. And so this is going to be the union together that Jesus is describing here in the story of God and his people through the Messiah. And yet he says that as the wedding banquet is being prepared, notice there's no mention of the bride, incidentally, but the son is getting married, and the bride, we know, becomes God's people, the church, and those who are Messianic Jews who believe in Messiah, Jesus the Messiah. They're the ones who come together and form the bride. And yet, these people who are described as those now, remember this is a story, so there are limitations to how far it goes, but these people are now invited guests. And he says, you're invited to come to the wedding. You're invited to be part of it. You've been chosen. And these teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they knew that they had actually rejected. Now, they knew who Jesus was. Now, that might surprise some of us, that they actually knew who he was. They realized that he was the Messiah. They show evidence of that, yet they refused to accept him. And I think primarily because he didn't fit the stereotype of what they thought Messiah was going to be. So maybe that cast a doubt in their minds. They were waiting for this great victorious leader, kind of a military style character who would come in, who would sweep through the nations, who would overthrow the Romans, who would take Jerusalem by storm, who would set up a royal palace, and suddenly Jerusalem would become the capital of a new empire that was going to rise. The Romans would be gone forever, and that Jerusalem and its king would rule. And theirs would be a kingdom that lasted, unlike the Egyptian kingdom that came and went, the Assyrian kingdom that came and went, the Babylonian kingdom that came and went, the Greek kingdom that came and went, and now the Romans, which were in full power at the time. And yet, Jesus came so humbly. He came just a couple of days before into his great city as the king, riding on no less than a donkey. Not just that, a young donkey. He came not with red carpets, but with coats strewn across the floor and palm branches ripped from the trees. He came not with military bands and trumpets, but with children singing Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What a disappointment. And these people said, this cannot be Messiah, surely. But it was. So having realized that Jesus was talking about them, they were now looking for a way to kill him, because he said, in fact, that he was going to destroy them. You see, for rejecting and turning away from him, for killing the servants who were sent, some people see that as the Old Testament prophets, maybe, but I think it probably also refers to the New Testament apostles as well. Many of them were also killed. It's interesting that Jesus actually says, I'm not going to turn up the scriptures because of time today, but Jesus actually quotes and says, can a prophet die outside of Jerusalem? That's where all the prophets died. He talks about Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and beat those who were sent to you. That's Jerusalem. Jesus had spent time weeping over the city. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only you had known what was coming to you. If only you'd known who I am. If only you'd received me. And yet he says there will be judgment that comes. And if you look at Luke's passage on that, it's very interesting that Jesus says that judgment's going to come. What happened is that, of course, in AD 70, just a few decades later, that judgment came, and this was the great fall of Jerusalem. In AD 70, the Romans came in, they destroyed the city, they burned it to the ground, they pulled the temple down, they knocked every stone one off another, even though the disciples had said, wow, Jesus, look at this temple, look at this construction, look at these massive stones, we've never seen anything like it before. And Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, not one stone will stand upon another. Every one will be torn down. Jesus was being prophetic. And he's prophetic here in this parable as well, because towards the end he tells us that in fact what he's going to do, this king, is that he will burn their city. Their city is Jerusalem. So in AD 70, who is it that actually destroyed Jerusalem? Was it the Romans? Yes, it was. But they were acting as the servants of God. This was a judgment upon God's people, upon Israel, for rejecting their Messiah, for turning away from him. And instead, we need to move on and get to the second half of this parable, really. Instead, what happens is, having rejected those to whom he was sent, those who were invited, and turned their backs on him, he says instead to his servants, I want you to go now out into the streets, to the street corners, and I want you to invite in anyone you find. Declare aloud, proclaim in the same way that you did them. You went with your scrolls and you proclaimed, the king invites you to the wedding. He says, now I want you to go and do the same thing. Go to the street corners and declare, the king invites you to the wedding. Come, you're invited. I don't care who they are, he says, the good or the bad. Invite them to come in, that this wedding feast will be full of people. I don't mind who they are. Those who were invited didn't deserve to come. Now just go and invite anybody. And what happened in the subsequent years is that the gospel was taken, just as Jesus said it would be, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And it got wider and wider, and the message, the call was the same. Come to the banquet. Come to the wedding feast. Come, everything is prepared and ready. I'm just waiting for you to turn up. That's all. Good or bad, it doesn't matter. You come in. And some have said, of course, that these were the ones, these are the poor, and they would not have the money to buy wedding garments, particularly of the quality required for a royal wedding. And so the argument's made that each one would have been given robes as they entered. And if we want to take that as a picture, there's some biblical kind of backup for that, because, of course, we come not in our own righteousness, but we are clothed with the righteousness of Christ. He clothes us to come into the presence of Almighty God. And so he says, you can't come on your own. You have to come in what he gives you. And so he says, be clothed in the righteousness, the righteous deeds that come through Christ. Enter into his presence. Approach the King. Come into the wedding feast of his great Son. And then he says, the King's going to come in. The King is going to come to meet the guests. This is a day of judgment. The good and the bad are allowed in, but not on their terms. The good and the bad are allowed through the door, but they're on his terms. They have to be properly clothed. And there are lots of people today saying it's great, isn't it, that God has thrown the door open and says anyone is welcome to come into my kingdom. And yet there are conditions. And I hear people all the same saying, if God is a God of love and mercy, he'll let me in. Are you wearing the wedding clothes? Are you clothed in the righteousness of Christ? Because there is a day when judgment will come. The wedding feast is in full swing, if you like. And the King himself enters and he looks round at all the guests in all the wonderful finery that they're clothed in. And one stands out like a sore thumb, says Jesus, because he's in his work clothes. He's not in the wedding clothes at all. He's in everyday attire. And he comes up to him and he approaches him. I like the way he addressed him as friend. You see, he's not an enemy, he's a friend. He says, I wanted you to be here. I desired you to be here, but you're coming on your terms, not on my terms. And when that day of judgment comes, I think there are going to be many that Jesus would turn to and he would still call them, if you like, friend. He said, I wanted you. I desired that you would come. I invited you. I gave you everything you needed. And yet, you're not clothed in the righteousness of Christ. You've come in your own rags. Get out of my wedding. You cannot be here. You spoil it. Can you imagine how this person would have stood out from all the rest, all dressed so perfectly, and there is one in rags? How dare you come in here and spoil this wedding? He says, I won't have it. And this allusion to judgment, tie him hand and feet and throw him out into the darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And as Jesus concludes, many are invited, but few are chosen. He says, there are an awful lot of people not coming into my wedding banquet. But he says, the call, the invitation has gone out. All those who hear it, he says, you have the opportunity. All those who hear it, come to me. Come to me, he says, and I will give you what you need to come in. Come and enjoy it. And this wedding feast isn't going to last for 7 days. This one is going to last for eternity. This is an ongoing banquet. He says, come and enjoy. He says, you will never go hungry. You will never thirst. There will be no sorrow. It will be constant joy. Constant celebration for all eternity in my presence as I join my Son with his bride. Come and be part of that. And just simply today, just looking at this parable, it's not difficult to understand. The Jews who rejected Jesus, they still also have a chance, or some of them today, to come back. And many will. That's what Scripture tells us. But nevertheless, the invitation is now wide open. Jews and Gentiles alike. All who hear the voice of the Lord, all who hear his invitation, are invited to come. Question is, are you there? He says, come because the banquet is ready. It's not, it will be ready at some point. It starts now. It starts here and now. And if you know Christ and you're with him and clothed in his righteousness, you're at the wedding. It's begun. And there will come that final time when the hand of the bride and the groom will be put together, and that marriage will then go on to be consummated. But for now, we're in the preliminary celebrations. Enjoy it. It's part of what being a Christian is all about. But if you're trying to get in through the back door without the wedding clothes, just saying, hey, he's a compassionate, gracious God. He'll let me in. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. He won't. He'll spot you. He won't let you in. Make every effort to put those wedding clothes on, to be clothed in the righteousness that comes from knowing Jesus Christ. Let's pray.